Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and happy International Women's Day wherever you are in the world. I'm Regina Yao, and I'm founder and president of the Pixel Project. And today I'm moderating a special Pixel Project live stream panel session for Women's History Month. And this is the first ever Women's History panel that the Pixel Project is hosting, and we are kicking things off with the topic, When History Does Not Repeat Itself, Lessons from the Past About Ending Violence Against Women. And here to take part in today's discussion panel are two distinguished historians of gender and women's history. And here we go. And to my right is Dr. Megha Kumar. And Dr. Megha Kumar is the Chief Product Officer and Head of Geopolitical Risk at the global cyber consultancy SciExcel. A Rhodes Scholar with a doctorate from the University of Oxford, Megha is also an established gender historian and the author of the seminal work Communalism and Sexual Violence in India, The Politics of Gender, Ethnicity and Conflict. She regularly speaks at conferences and media outlets on the specific gender-based consequences of ethnic conflict, nationalist politics, and religious movements, and on strategies to prevent violence against minorities and disadvantaged groups. And beneath us, literally on the screen, is Dr. Rebecca Turkington. And Dr. Turkington is a fellow at the Georgetown University Institute for Women, Peace and Peace and Security. She holds a PhD in history from the University of Cambridge, where her research focused on global women's organizing and colonialism. Prior to returning to academia, Rebecca spent nearly a decade working in gender, security, and foreign policy. And you, the audience, will also be able to ask them questions live today. Just make sure you are logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the screen. And Jay and Xiao Chin, who are today's producers and chat box moderators, will relay them to me to read out to our panel to answer. So get your questions ready. So here we go. Before we begin the discussion, just a quick introduction to what we're going to be talking about today. So while violence against women has been around for as long as the patriarchy has existed, there is a curious gap in the way history is used as a reference and resource in the movement to end violence against women. So usually to drive home the realities of violence against women in support of crucial anti-violence against women work in the hostile environment of the patriarchy, where victim blaming and silencing is prevalent, activists and advocates commonly draw on two types of historical sources. The first is accounts from personal and wider social histories about the horrors of gender-based violence. And the second is the terrifying statistics and percentages about violence against women. However, even while violence against women has been exceedingly difficult to eradicate over the centuries, there have been examples of resistance by women and communities across the centuries, some resulting in the extinction of specific forms of violence against women and girls, while other efforts remain ongoing till this day. Ending violence against women is a long game, and we believe that history, especially the hidden her stories of women, will offer valuable and strategic insight, ideas, and inspiration for activists and advocates worldwide today as they fight for a future without violence against women and girls. So today, in acknowledgement of the importance of using history as a positive resource in the battle to end this violence, the panel will be talking about what we can learn from historical examples about ending violence against women today and in the future, why activists and advocates working to end violence against women might consider drawing inspiration from historical examples to tackle the violence, and how activists and advocates can discover examples of historical activism that successfully eradicated violence against women, given the silencing of women's voices in history. With all these in mind, let's get the discussion rolling. Welcome, Megha, and welcome, Rebecca. Thank you for joining us for today's panel session. So let's kick things off with this. So while the history of violence against women across the world is endlessly bleak and brutal. There have been a few bright spots here and there. Specific forms of gender-based violence, such as sati in India, bound in China, the witch hunt trials of Europe and the US, which have all been successfully eradicated. Now, violence against women has been notoriously difficult to stamp out because it is a feature of the patriarchy. So, what makes the rare cases of the total extermination of a form of violence against women the exception to the rule? So, let's start with Rebecca.
Great. Well, first, I just want to say thanks for inviting me. I'm delighted to be a guinea pig in your first historical panel. I believe history is a really important thing to draw from, so I'm delighted that we'll be able to talk more about that today. To answer your question, I think I will give the historian's cop-out, which is to say that it's complicated. We love to say that, and it is always true. But I think that there's a lot of different factors that happened in these cases. And I think it comes down to requiring both an organized and creative movement against violence, but also a particular political, social, and economic moment that the movement can take advantage of. So I can talk briefly about foot binding in China, for instance. This was a practice that continued for hundreds of years. Towards the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, you really see it, as you say, become almost totally eradicated. And historians point to different factors when they think about why that happened. So some historians look at the important social organizing efforts by Chinese men and women. Much like all forms of violence against women, foot binding was entangled with a broader set of social norms. So it was related to women's marriageability, to women's economic advancement. And so ending the practice really required changing a lot of other social customs at the same time. There were coordinated educational campaigns that drew on local vocabularies and on Confucian cultural frameworks. There was this really innovative practice of creating sort of clubs and societies around foot binding that worked to de-link foot binding from the marriage market. So parents would sign pledges saying that they would not bind their daughters' feet, but importantly, they'd also sign pledges saying they would not allow their sons to marry a woman with bound feet. So these are really smart tactics to try to isolate the practice from the broader social context. But other historians talk about it from the perspective of the changing economic context. It had once been an economic advantage to have women tied to the home, but as these new possibilities, whether factory work, whether professional life, opened to women, foot binding prevented them from being able to participate in that. So there's certainly an economic factor there. And other historians point to the political context. The Chinese nationalist movement was one that really embraced modernity, and they pointed to foot binding as this kind of out-of-date practice and tradition that kept China back. So all three of these factors are definitely at work. And I think that the lesson to draw from these is that you do actually need this combination of a movement and a moment, that there's often really ambitious and passionate activists who are only able to make very incremental changes in the face of a really challenging context. But if there isn't that organizing, we see points of transition that could be transformative that only reinscribe these norms. So the lesson is you have to do both, and you have to play the long game, as you say.
Megha, any thoughts?
Yeah, Rebecca, thank you. And Regina, before I share my thoughts on this, thank you so very much for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm delighted to be here to share what I know about this and to sort of, collectively advance the cause that we all firmly believe in. It is a long game. The fight is not over, but none of us is going to give up. The case that I want to talk about briefly is the practice of widow immolation, which was called sati. It was practiced in some parts of South Asia for hundreds of years. It continued during colonial rule in South Asia, and the practice was outlawed in 1829. So it's a pretty recent thing if you look at the long arc of history. In important ways, the abolition of sati and its near elimination in the South Asian context happened exactly through the combination of factors that Rebecca has described so beautifully with regard to Chinese foot binding. It was a combination of both movement and moment. Movement because there was the start of an anti-colonial movement within India at the time, and as colonial powers started criticizing India for its backwardness, its cruelty against women, the fact that they thought it was a white man's burden to lift the lot of Indian women, led to an indigenous movement for sort of social reform and religious reform. And the movement was also right because there was a rapid emergence of an educated Indian intelligentsia at the time that was able to have the political clout, the economic resources, and the communication platforms that would have been necessary to have a public debate about this. It's the same sort of, the expansion of radio access, expansion of printed media through pamphlets and newspapers, and obviously sort of ground level mobilization. The three things that, if I summarize the factors that a whole range of historians have raised in regard to why this practice was successfully eliminated, are these three. First of all, the ban, and it was effective pretty quickly, came into play only when the colonial government was extremely sure-footed about its authority to enforce the rule of law. So while obviously we are not living in a colonial world now, the fact that the government, whatever its hue or nature at the time, felt that it had the ability, the will, and the resources to strictly enforce the rule of law had a very important role to play. So this is obviously a lesson for us now. The second was the willingness of the intelligentsia, the Indian intelligentsia, to disentangle the various components that were driving this problem, and therefore then to take action against those constituent bits. Just as Rebecca described with regard to child binding, if there is a movement, for example, where parents are telling their sons not to marry a woman who has had her feet bound, a very similar process was happening in India in the 18th century, 17th century and onwards, where the intelligentsia asked itself, well, why is this practice happening within a group of primarily Hindu upper caste women? Well, partly it's happening because there were, widow remarriage was not a done thing amongst Hindus, whereas among Muslims and some lower caste communities, widow remarriage was not a problem at all. So in that sense, there was no incentive in these communities, in these other communities, to sort of coerce the widows to burn themselves after their husband had died. So in turn, then they introduced a Hindu Widow Remarriage Act, right? So sort of you're addressing the various economic, political, or religious beliefs that are perpetuating the problem, and then you're hoping that by addressing these small constituent bits, you can address the larger problem. And it was very largely effective. The third reason is that the intelligentsia, because of its own self-assumed commitment to social reform, religious reform, and the birth of a modern India, they were willing, unevenly and sometimes very controversially, but nonetheless they were willing to de-link the problem of sati and what could be done to address it entirely from whether it had religious, scriptural, or customary practice authorization. It just didn't matter whether the practice was sanctioned under Hinduism or not, under customary law or not. For them, the issue was sort of had been brought out of the religious domain. Like I said, it was not an even or an uncontroversial position, because many of them took a sort of pro-religious view on why they should abolish sati or not. But nonetheless, there was enough of a momentum for the government, for the intelligentsia to say, well, regardless of religion, this is not a practice that we should allow. So I think some of the commonalities between the foot binding case and sati case offer us some very promising lessons for the future.
Yeah, and I just to sort of put in 2 cents, I did China studies at Oxford, and we looked at foot binding as well. And interestingly, it's the intelligentsia as well who led the charge, and the intelligentsia are the upper class in Chinese society because education is so valued. And it's because they refused, because it was a time-honored way for a woman, a girl from the lower classes or a poorer family to marry up. So they, and the upper class families wanted brides with bound feet. So they bound their feet. So it was really important for the intelligentsia to say, no, we are not going to do this anymore. And it's not acceptable anymore. So I just wanted to add that little bit there. Because, yeah, it's really interesting how there's so many commonalities there. And let's see how it can be applied to activism today. So let's go on to talking about why, despite the fact that there have been a few examples of specific types of violence against women being completely abolished across history, well, it still seems like many women's human rights activists and advocates today don't consider or use them as a knowledge resource for ideas for tackling violence against women. Why do you think this is the case? And do you think history has its place and function in the fight to end violence against women? Rebecca.
So I think there's a lot of reasons for this, and some of them are tied to the same reasons that women's history in general is a much smaller piece of the historical field, and some of them are tied specifically to the histories of violence against women. So I think the first reason is just that these stories are not really part of our educations. I think wherever we are in the world, typically our curriculums are not focusing on women's roles in history, and women tend to be the ones who are leading these anti-violence movements. I just was reading this morning about the statistics in the United States, my own country, where only 1 in 8 figures mentioned in historical textbooks are women. So first, it requires people to really look beyond what they're familiar with and what they've grown up with. And that's hard if you don't have a background in this and if you don't have the resources. I think secondly, violence against women is often a hard story to tell. As we've been talking about, change is very slow. Progress is sometimes cyclical. And so there's not really this narrative of teleological progress that we can point to because we're still in the middle of changing these social norms. I also think the perpetrators of violence in these cases are often the people with the most power. So whether that's a colonial power, a conquering army, or just the people in a society who hold power, who are usually men, it's very uncomfortable sometimes to tell these stories. And there's often a powerful backlash when they become public. And I think that carries over into the historical world as well. And I think finally it's complicated because a lot of these movements in the past were flawed. Megha spoke about the influence of colonialism and the way that colonial powers pointed to violence against women as an example of, backwardness or the barbaric nature. That's absolutely true, and it comes up in my research as well in North Africa, where colonial powers actually refused to change legal norms despite an indigenous movement asking for legal reform because it was so important for them to be able to point to violence against women as an example of why their continued power was necessary. So I think a lot of, the early campaigns against trafficking relied on a lot of racist ideas about white slavery. A lot of the early rhetoric around violence against women was tied up in these colonial and civilizationalist ideas. And so we really have to see these campaigns with all of that nuance and understand both the opportunities, but also the pitfalls from the past. So it makes it a difficult story to tell in sort of an understandable, easy, pithy way. So I think those are some of the reasons why this isn't as widely known.
Megha?
Yeah, I think Rebecca has really listed out all the things that I would have raised. So let me address the second part of the question, Regina, that you had answered. Does history have a role to play? Can it now teach us something that we can take forward into the 21st century and beyond? I think there are many things. One of them is to use history as a reference point for multiple questions. So one question obviously that we are asking here is, what are the forms of violence that have been abolished, and why did that happen, and what lessons can we draw? History, because of its multifaceted nature and because as a discipline it's grown and become so much richer over the last 200 years all over the world, we can now ask other questions, such as uh, what were the conditions that led certain communities or in certain contexts to not have that kind of violence at all? So, for example, when I was talking about sati, and I can give you an example from Europe in a second. When I was talking about sati, most of the cases of sati, and they were an alarming number, so about 3,000, 4,000 per year, and that was just the recorded number. It was primarily concentrated in some central western states of the country. There were large parts of India where there was nothing called sati, it was never a practice. So, looking at why certain communities, customs, devout communities do not have certain kinds of violence are an equally important reference point, that what made them never embrace this form of sort of patriarchal oppression. In Europe, for example, in witch hunting peaked in about the 15th and early 16th centuries. And I think by the end of 1690s, you kind of see basically the witch hunting hysteria sort of begins to decline, and the last convictions of that happened in the early sort of just towards the end of the 17th century. For the most part, witch hunting and witch hunting trials had ended. But again, even with witch hunting trials, it was concentrated in some parts of some countries. And, southwestern Germany, for example, had the highest concentration of witch hunting trials. So looking, if even if you're a historian of, say, witch hunting, the recent research points us not just to the incidents and cases and contexts where this violence did occur, but also equally interconnected areas of the same period within the same context who did not have this violence. So instead of just looking at the abolishment history, which is absolutely vital, history allows us to get lessons by asking a different question and looking at its history. And I found this in my research on post colonial India. My own research work is on sexual violence and ethnic conflict, specifically Hindu Muslim violence in the western state of Gujarat. And what I found was that in the four major riots that I looked at, 1969, 1985, 1992, and 2002, 1985, so in a broad arc of history, it's very close to both 69 and 92. You find that in 1985, sexual violence was actively avoided by the community at the ground level, even during the riot, whereas it did occur in 1969, and it did occur in 1992 and in 2002. So where the absence of violence, whether it's historical or momentary and contextual, those absences are extremely important historical examples for us to learn from.
So we need to look at what these communities are doing right.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's interesting because we are flipping things around and not just looking at examples of things being abolished, but examples of how they never started in the first place. That's interesting. Well, that sort of leads us to our next question, which is, given how much the world has changed even in the last 25 years, and I don't know about both of you, but I keep feeling like change has been coming in faster and faster since we hit the 21st century. Do you think that the strategies and tactics used by individuals and communities involved in these historical cases, and or maybe involved in the what you brought up just now, Megha, the areas where all these uh, types of violence against women never happened. Do you think that these strategies and tactics can be applied to 21st century anti-violence against women activism and advocacy, Rebecca?
I think absolutely. I mean, there's certainly some things that require tactical changes just because of the rapidly changing communications technology, ways people learn things, ways people connect with each other. But I think at base, a lot of these tactics just appeal to human nature. And in that sense, they're sort of evergreen. I think there's a couple other things that help us from learning about these strategies. One is also just the inspiration and sort of the comfort of knowing that the work we do today is built on the shoulders of others. And that, taking up this torch is a reminder that we're not really alone. This is a long haul fight, and there's been brave, tireless people who've been role models for a long time. But also it reminds us how hard this work can be. And understanding these people and movements in the past, often their work did not pay off until long after they were gone. So I think giving us a longer term perspective and recognizing sort of the courage and the patience and the long-term vision that this type of work requires can be a helpful way of thinking about strategy, even if we're not drawing on the direct tactics. But I also would say, we were talking about this briefly at the beginning, we're living in a time where in many, many countries, there's rapidly closing civic space. There's increasingly dangerous atmospheres for activism, especially when we work on gender issues. Gender ideology, whatever that is sort of the first thing that's attacked by these ultra-right authoritarian governments. And that puts us all in the crosshairs. And I think that people are starting to think about older forms of protest. In the United States right now, there's a lot of interest in how can we organize people not using the platforms that are owned by the people who are creating this environment. What does it look like to build a movement without social media or even without the internet or phones? And looking to the past offers these kind of evergreen ways of building coalitions, creating narratives that resonate with people, and doing the kind of person-to-person outreach that can really move the needle on a lot of these issues. So I think it's both important to think about it just to have an understanding of our field, but also we might be able to borrow some of those tactics because of the way that civic space looks right now.
Yeah, that's interesting because the Pixel Project actually interviewed Ha-Won Jung last year, and she wrote Flowers of Fire about South Korea's feminism. And she was saying that one of the reasons why she decided to write the book it's not just because people are, the Hallyu wave brought in a lot of interest on South, got a lot of women interested in South Korea, but also that a lot of the older Korean feminists grew up during turbulent political times, and they learned how to organize like a boss. And so South Korea actually has one of the most robust feminist protest communities in the world. And they are not doing it online. They're organizing on the ground. And all that came directly from history. The very recent history, which we're going to talk about recent history soon, the very, very recent history of South Korea. But Megha, do you have anything to add to the topic about
Yes.
Yeah,
in fact, I want to sort of underline the point that both you and Rebecca have made. We have had, unfortunately, democratic backsliding for at least 10 years in an increasingly large part of the world. And one fallout of that democratic backsliding has been deprioritization, or now in more recent time, an active backlash against sort of feminist politics. And with regard to India, for example, India has had a uneven democratic history since independence in 1947. We've had a clear departure from democracy briefly in the late 70s as well. For the most part, however, whatever gaps and limits there were still broadly within a democratic ethos. In the last 10 years, we've had a much sharper backlash against the kind of liberal feminism or even post-liberal feminism that movements of the world. And that has shrunk the space for people to use public platforms, what they can say, what they can raise funds for, what they can mobilize around, etc. I think, uh, well, since the battle has to go on, again, I think history can point to some very important lessons. Obviously, what previous generations of feminists learned when they were working in the context of political turmoil or religious turmoil, the kind we had in Europe, for example, that is obviously great. The other thing that I think we can draw from is the work that has been done in the last 20 years on changes brought about at the community level. Because in community level changes, whether it's about marriage age of consent issues, dowry, things like that, a lot of sticky change can be brought about at the community level. And when that happens, it kind of almost can fly below the radar of nationalist politics, where you then have to deal with the subversive attitude. So, in a way, the if the broader national platform shrinks, then expanding our footprint at the community level would make sense to me.
That's interesting because there's so many cases in India where villages have successfully eradicated, say, female infanticide. And there's one village where the head of the village decided that for every girl child that was born, they would plant fruit trees, and fruit brings in a lot of profit. So if you have a girl child, if they announce that a girl is born, they would plant fruit trees, and then the profit from the fruit trees would fund the education of the girl, would fund her family, and they eradicated female infanticide in that village within a decade, just within a decade.
Yeah.
So sticky change, isn't it? I like that. I like that idea of sticky change, and it changes at the grassroots, I think. So that kind of leads us to another question, which is examples of fully eradicated violence against women happened at least a century ago. When we talk about Sati, when we talk about Bound Feet, when we talk about the witch hunt trials, and might be considered obscure or not relatable by today's activists and advocates. And this ties in with what Rebecca said about people are just untaught that when they're being educated in schools these days. Do you think it might be more relevant for activists and advocates to consider examples in more recent history whereby the specific form of gender-based violence has not yet been fully abolished, but has shown progress in that direction? For example, with female genital mutilation, even though in the last 5 years there's been a spike again, thanks to the pandemic, and the same with child marriage. They were making progress right up until 2020, when the pandemic shut everything down and poverty levels went up and climate change is kicking in more fiercely than before. So, Rebecca, what are your thoughts about that, about using more recent history?
Yeah, I actually would just echo what Megha said about these looking to the local, because I think the recurring pattern we see both from history and from our world today is that locally rooted strategies are so critical. Building educational strategies that use a vocabulary that resonates with the people that you're trying to influence, using religious or cultural or human rights frameworks that people are invested in, and creating programs that attack the specific cultural barriers that are exacerbating violence in whatever context you're working in. I think that requires a lot of creativity. And for me, the most exciting thing about looking to the recent past is just being able to see the wide range of efforts that other people are working on. I think in today's world where it's so easy to learn from each other, you can see a lot of that sort of, contagion is not the right word for it, but the sharing of ideas. I actually asked a colleague, I mentioned that I was speaking on this panel, and immediately they were like, oh, you should talk about all this great work that we did in the DRC and in Guatemala. Like, these two very, very different contexts, and we have partners there who have created these forms of response to violence that integrate both the justice system, the mental health system, and the physical health response. And this colleague was like, that holistic idea is something that we just use as a model for everywhere. It's not going to work the same way in every country, but we can learn from what Dennis Mukwege is doing in the Congo. We can learn from what Claudia Paz is doing in Guatemala. And I think that is what we can learn from the recent past, sort of what are the culturally specific things that may not work in your context, but can inspire you to do something similar.
Megha?
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree with Rebecca's recommendation, and I'd add one here. I think one of the things that recent history can teach us is also about ways in some areas where we go one step forward and two step back. So let me give you an example. So, dowry-related violence and harassment has been a centuries-old problem in large parts of South Asia, definitely, but for the longest part, it was within certain communities. It was concentrated, for example, among Hindus, where traditionally it's the bride that brings a dowry to the husband's home. The practice wasn't up until very recently all that common amongst Muslims and Christians, because actually it was the husband who to give a dowry to the bride, or amongst Dalits where it was just not considered. It was just not part of the traditional vocabulary of marriage. What we have seen over the last 10, 15 years in a lot of emerging economies, including India, but also I'd include Pakistan in that, Nepal in that, is that communities which, relatively speaking, had no entrenched history of dowry related violence have now started experiencing it. And that is not so much a product of changing religious norms or changing of the state laws, because those have not changed. It's just the consumerist, materialist pressures that are now kind of informing overall public perception now have determined that relationship between dowry and family prestige. So where the public perception that is a scooty enough as a dowry is a 1970s sort of relic. But now, if a bride is taking anything less than a very fancy car and lots of furniture, etc., or jewelry, then that's just not considered to meet the expectations that the wider capitalist, materialist ethos expects. So I think one of the things that future activists can learn from with regard to recent history is how the broader macroeconomic situation altered public perceptions, collective experience, and in turn determined what kind of violence was going to happen or was going to be avoided, and then use those lessons to inspire what action they might take as the next fold of the macroeconomic context unfolds, which will be very technology driven. It will be driven by more women joining the labor force in an aggregate globally. And in terms of, at least in certain large parts of the world, if not all, sadly, there will be a greater push for women's access to equal pay, equal rights in the workplace. So as that ethos moves, where there are some things that hold women back and some things that propel them forward, what are the lessons you can draw from the previous moment of macroeconomic history to respond to the changes that the next phase will inevitably bring, some good and some bad?
So, if you just joined us, we are talking about when history does not repeat itself, lessons from the past about ending violence against women. Welcome, you just joined us. We are talking about how we can use history to combat as a resource to combat violence against women today in the 21st century. So, let's move on to talking about utilizing history as a resource for effective and actionable ideas for impactful anti-violence against women activism, especially for younger activists who, for who might come from educational systems where none of this is taught, especially in many conservative parts of the world where women's voices in history are still erased. So Anyway, given the silencing of women's voices in history, it can be difficult to find historical cases of gender-based violence that have been eliminated, or as Megha pointed out earlier in our discussion, uh, bright spots, areas in countries where these forms of violence against women have happened, but in these areas, these regions, they have not happened. They have they've been prevented from even happening. So where should activists and advocates who wish to begin tapping into history for ideas begin looking, and what can they do to track down these examples? Rebecca.
Yeah, I think there's three things that I would recommend doing. One is using academia, and that can be hard to navigate if you're not familiar with sort of the tools that are out there, but there is a lot of really exciting work being done on this topic that unfortunately stays within the academy. Historians are not always great about writing for a public audience, and so if you're not reading academic journals, they might care, but they don't necessarily know how to reach a broader audience. But sometimes if you just use an academic search engine and search the kinds of keywords, the specific country or region you're in, the specific issue area you care about, you might actually be surprised about how much work there is. If you're interested in domestic violence shelters in Turkey, there is some great writing about that. If you're interested in the history of rape and the American Civil Rights Movement, there's some really exciting stuff happening around that right now. And so there may be historians who are writing things that are directly relevant to your cultural context, but only available in an academic journal. So that can be as easy as, searching the keywords in Google Scholar or another sort of online repository, and then emailing the author to ask for a PDF. If you don't have access to it through an academic institution, people will send you their work because we are always flattered when someone cares. So I think that is just an easy tip. See what's out there and then write to the person who wrote it. My other suggestion is, as we've talked about, a lot of this is recent history, and a lot of the people who were part of these movements are still around. So I'm sure there are women in your own communities who were at the forefront of violence against women activism in the 1970s, in the 1990s. In my own country, those are kind of the two moments where there becomes this real cultural awareness and the institutionalization of efforts to, create infrastructure, create legal frameworks to stop violence against women. They probably faced the same challenges we're seeing today. And you can talk to them. Talking to the people who fought that fight the last time around shows us the possible paths forward and also helps build an intergenerational movement. And if you can record those conversations, that's a huge resource for historians like us in the future. And then finally, just because, as we've talked about, the feminist movement has really been a big mover and shaker behind violence against women activism, there's a lot of feminist history projects all over the world, and it's worth seeing what resources they have. In the United States, we have nonprofits like the National Women's History Museum. We have archives like the Schlesinger Library and the Sophia Smith Collection. In the UK, there's women's libraries in Glasgow and at the London School of Economics. I was in Morocco last month, and they have a lovely women's museum in Marrakesh. Like, these small NGOs are really trying to preserve this history. So looking around to see what's in your region and getting in touch with their staff is also a great way to see what's out there.
Megha, any recommendations?
Yeah, some slightly related and some hopefully new. One, I would recommend that all activists and all of us who care about women's equality and gender rights, we should read more widely. One of the lessons of history is that any change happened because of certain changes in religious customs, in laws, in economic conditions, in the political moment that they were in. In order to effect change today and going forward, you need to be able to understand all the various sort of dimensions of what makes violence happen. So I would very strongly encourage all activists to read as widely as possible, know your economics, know something about technology, know more about sort of how the legal jurisprudence works. You don't have to be an expert in any of these, But the more sort of generalist understanding you have of all these key dimensions, I firmly believe that that would make our efforts more effective. And this is not just my belief in a way, this is the lesson of history. The second is related to the point Rebecca made about recording the testimonies and experiences of previous generations of feminists to whom we owe so much. Record your own oral history. Unfortunately, a lot of our lived experience now lives on social media platforms, and all that is fine. But I think, given that most people on the planet do have access to the internet, the latest statistics, about 65% of the planet is online, and at least 5 billion of them are on social media, which means they have sufficient internet connectivity and hardware to access those platforms. Record your own history. Try and sort of gather the experience of women who have faced certain violence or have fought it successfully, of people who don't identify as binary male or female, and relatedly bring the stories of men into this. I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges and biggest opportunities for us in the next phase of the feminist movement. There are a lot more feminist men in the closet than there are outside in the world. And we need to help those men come out of the closet so they can be more vocal, so they can be more visible partners in this. Not only because many of them believe in gender equality, just don't know how to go about achieving it or helping to make that happen, but many of them only vaguely understand how patriarchy hurts them too. And I think the more we can partner with men who also don't want to be sort of bound by old masculinist ideas about men have to be strong, men have to be able to feed the family, and if you are unemployed, then that is sort of some kind of emasculation, or men don't cry. All the stereotypes, they hurt men just as much, and then they perpetuate violence against other men and women. So bringing men more into that field would be a great thing. And since we have the technology now to record oral history in a way that we didn't in the past, we should use it.
So, do you have any recommended resources, for example, specific books, websites, etc., for activists and advocates interested in learning from history, Rebecca?
I had a hard time preparing for this question because I think the violence against women work is so siloed by region, by time period, by topic, that it's often hard to point to one specific resource that's going to give you a real depth of understanding. There's, for instance, an academic journal called Violence Against Women, and they publish some great interdisciplinary work. But typically, historical scholarship on this is subsumed by regional histories. So I think a lot of it depends on what you're specifically interested in. I'll just point to a few places where I've been reading recently, and I've read some really fascinating work. One is a lot of new writing that looks at the history of anti-violence work in the 1970s, focusing on the creation of women's shelters and rape crisis centers. There's been a real proliferation of writing on that across Europe and the United States. Jane Freeland has a great new book out about what that looked like in East and West Germany. My friend Alice McKim and Charlotte Robertson, Jill Haig, Muniza Inam, they've all written about that in the UK. Berna Eccles writing about it in Turkey. I think that's a really interesting period in the history of violence against women. So reading about that has been exciting for me. There's a great writing on the history of conflict-related sexual violence, which is a specific form that I work on a lot, working in the women, peace, and security community. The evolution of our understanding of that as a war crime really happened in the 1990s. You see the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, these courageous Bosnian women sharing their stories for the first time. That feeds into the 1995 Beijing platform, this recognition that violence against women is actually a human rights issue. And that allows a new vocabulary and a new framework for women to bring Beijing home, as I said, after that conference, to come back and say, listen, this is something that the international community has collectively decided is a crime, and we need to incorporate that into a national legal framework. There's a lot of excellent work on how that happened and the evolution of that global response. So Carrie Crawford's book on wartime sexual violence gives a great overview. Diane Mazarana's work in political science. There's several really powerful documentaries out, especially on the Bosnian War. I Came to Testify is a great one, or The Silence of Reason. So I think these are just two areas where I've seen a lot of exciting work, but whatever your particular interest and area is, there may well be a growing body of evidence. Another thing I've been reading recently are American scholars looking at the intersections between violence against women and race, which I think, especially in American history, are inextricable. And so Crystal Feimster's new book, Southern Horrors, which looks at 19th century America, and then Danielle Lynn McGuire has a new one called At the Dark End of the Street, which looks at the American civil rights movement through the lens of violence against women. And I think those are some really important ways to tie this story to the broader social context of the time. So yeah, I wish I could offer you one go-to place, but instead it's a lot of searching to find what's most relevant to you.
Megha, any recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, I'll sort of try and offer the parallel track because Rebecca's list has been comprehensive, and I think her fundamental point is, in fact, the most important, which is that because a lot of the studies can be siloed within a region in a type of context, in a way you can, you have to do the work of reading both in depth on that area, but also diagonally to sort of learn from different types of regions and different types of ways of fighting. I think the other thing that is useful is a lot of research institutions that make excellent research available, and then they also aggregate them either across different time periods so you can see the trends, or across different regions so you can see regional variations. So for example, the Pew Center in the United States does fantastic work. Some of it is global, some of it is American focused, but it gives you a sense of the direction of travel. And that can be a very useful resource. Similarly, the Oxford Internet Institute releases some fantastic work on gender in media, which is hugely important for the fight that lies ahead of us. Beyond that, I think we should make more effective use of Google search. There is a lot of information very easily accessible. It's not of even quality, and it does take some doing, but we, unlike the previous generation of feminists, we have the great advantage of having much more access to knowledge, and the barriers to that access are constantly falling. So we should leverage that. And in fact, even resources like ChatGPT, you have to stress test those outputs, because AI technology is deeply flawed and it can create plausible sounding gibberish. But nonetheless, if that tool is available to you, use it, to sort of search for themes and some approaches. It'll give you a starting point. You don't learn how to swim at the deep end of the pool. So start in the shallow waters and make your way.
Yeah. And I'm also going to suggest that maybe look at universities and colleges that have a history of being women's universities and colleges. I'm saying this because I'm a product of those.
Me too.
Every single university and college I attended have a history of started as women's colleges or women's universities. And because of a lot of silencing of women's voices, if you go into, a lot of them have archives online now. So if you go into those archives, you can actually find a lot of history and a lot of women who have done a lot of amazing things stopping violence against women, working in the feminist movement, working as women's human rights defenders. And if no one else records their achievements, the college will do it. So maybe look at that as a resource as well. So let's go to the final question for today, which is, given that there are cases where violence against women has been abolished, even though it's just specific types of violence against women. Do you think that it is possible that someday all forms of violence against women can end for good, Rebecca?
Well, I think, as you said, violence against women is as old as the patriarchy. So it's going to be a long fight. But I draw a lot of hope from the progress of just the past century. I think, as Megha said earlier, seeing, even though we're talking about the 19th or the 20th century, these forms of violence were rooted so much earlier than that. We're thinking about, thousands of years timeline. And it's really only in the past 200, 250 years that people have started to organize around this as a real social harm. So I think it seems to us maybe like progress is agonizingly slow, but even within our own lifetimes, there's really been a sea change, both in recognizing violence against women as a problem and in starting to build institutions that combat it. So I don't want to say, that we in our lifetimes are going to see the eradication of violence against women, but I do think that progress is accelerating and we should draw a lot of hope from the recent past. The people who, as I said, were creating the first women's shelters, winning first legal protections in court battles, fighting to get violence against women recognized as a global human rights issue, they're all still alive. So this has really been one generation that's seen a lot of change on this issue, and I think it's only the beginning. That being said, I think because this is so intertwined with larger power structures, we might be seeing this one step forward, two steps back around the world. Rooting out the many different manifestations of violence is very difficult. And I think it requires a huge amount of organizing and advocacy so that we have a movement that's ready for the moment when we have these transitions to really seize the transformative power of that. I went to see a Broadway musical about the American suffrage movement a few weeks ago, and the final song has this line that progress is possible, not guaranteed. And I think that's very true. Like, we've seen that this is possible. We've seen that there are places where women have done it, but that progress is not guaranteed unless other people are going to take up the torch.
Megha?
Yeah, I think I want to pick up on the last point Rebecca made, which is about power structures. In a way, the history of not just the feminist movement, but race-based equality movements or religious-based equality movements or anti-colonial movements. One of the things that they all have in common is that they were all striking from different angles at the fundamental problematic power structure that was in place, which made some people privileged, powerful, and in their eyes superior, and others not so much. I think going forward, we need to partner with similar movements, whether it's the LGBT community, whether it is movements that are fighting primarily through a racial lens or through a religious minority lens or through anti-poverty movements, the movement for recognizing and sort of reducing the barriers to people who are disabled, and also barriers to children, because all those things are interconnected. And we cannot. What would not be a great situation to be in is if we continue some of the patterns of where we are, where broadly speaking, violence against white, wealthier women is lower than violence against wealthier brown women, and that in turn is you kind of see that if you go down various racial hierarchies, economic hierarchies, and definitely between abled and disabled women, then that their vulnerability increases. We can't create that kind of hierarchy going forward where we kind of win it for ourselves but don't not so much for the people who are even more disadvantaged than us. So I think collaborating across movements, we will all I think, but through that collaboration, we will all end up in a better place.
Yeah. And taking an intersectional approach is common sense anyway, because nobody's just one thing. Nobody's just in one category. Every
Exactly.
woman is a cross section of different marginalities, different social pressures, different things, different oppressive norms that she has to fight. And so we need to look at everything in order to stop it all. All right, so we have come to the end of our panel session today. Thank you so much, Megha and Rebecca, for being with us today. And thank you to everybody who joined us today in the audience. We were hoping you would ask questions, but you did not have any questions. But feel free to, contact the Pixel Project if you have any questions about violence against women. And we can get you started there, because that's part of our mission we're for beginners. If you have not thought about the issue of violence against women before, you want to do something, you don't know where to start, you want to learn about it, you don't know where to start, go to our website. And I believe one of our mods has put our website in the chat. So you can click on that and go from there. And if you would like to donate to us, Jay has also put our donation link there. You can click on it and just donate to us online. And thank you all, everyone, again for joining us today. Have a really great International Women's Day, and I hope that you enjoy all the activities that are happening around the world today. And throughout this whole month, it's also Women's History Month, and it's also Women in Horror Month. So if you are interested in the horror genre, which is also a great vehicle for social critique, there are lots of things going on. But have a good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you so much, Regina. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Regina. Thank you, Rebecca. I couldn't think of a more wonderful way to sort of mark International Women's Day than spending it with the two of you having a fantastic conversation. Thank you so very much for the opportunity.